last time Casson and I were chatting, we were really chatting about more things related to hypertrophy training and everything related to bodybuilding. But a lot of the stuff I feel like Casson does is kind of like myth busting. And I wanted to start addressing practical applications to cardio. And before we kind of went down that rabbit hole, I said, hey, let me get Doc involved with this, and we can kind of share our thoughts. I would like to get Casson's thoughts, and maybe discuss some of the differences between what the literature has demonstrated, and talk about the strengths and weaknesses there because of the issues with the populations that have been studied, maybe the duration of the study length and stuff like that. But I think it's super important for people just to get a good idea of what practical applications we do actually implement and do recommend, and how that might actually vary from what's demonstrated in the literature. Because we were talking about a lot of people in the evidence-based space staying away from fasted cardio, or 10 years ago everybody was saying that high intensity is better than low intensity, and then things kind of shifted and they're like, doesn't matter as long as calories are equated. So I thought we can just have a good discussion in regards to cardiovascular training for fat loss.
Yeah, I know. I think that's great. And I think one important thing that I think would be good to discuss is the difference in training. I think the average Joe just is looking to kind of get healthy, relative to that person that's trying to take it to the next level, where they're actually going closer to maybe just having the essential fat, or even maybe below the essential fat, as is often required for competitors. Because I think that's where the space that we're discussing, particularly in the paper that we co-authored, I think that's where it's going to really be more impactful. And I think that's where you're going to see most of these differences really really come into play. For sure.
Yeah, there's also just such a big difference in the volume of training that those two different populations are working with too, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely, the volume, and then even just their starting points. The best study that we have to compare this whole thing to, in terms of fasted, that's a chronically done study, is only a 4-week intervention. It was only on females, and their starting body fat percentages were somewhere around 20, 22, 23, 24%, which is, fairly not overweight or obese by any means. I mean, they were athletic women, but certainly not the starting point of most of the physique women that we see, where, they might start at maybe 17, 18, 19, 20%. I think the literature states somewhere around the 20% mark. So they're already starting leaner, and then now they're going for a longer period of time, and they're going to get to much below of what's kind of considered even acceptable or healthy. They're going to be going, sub 10% body fat, 8% body fat in some of these females that's been documented.
Okay, awesome. I mean, Cassim just made a great point before too, talking about the different populations, their training volumes are so different. So whether you're a coach or just a practitioner or an athlete, you need to take into consideration how the cardio that you're performing is going to impact your weight training performance. Is it going to improve your recovery by any means, or is it going to hinder your recovery and then deter your performance? So, what are your thoughts in regards to programming low intensity steady state versus high intensity interval training for both the lay person and the general population, or the competitive athlete? Like how might that vary?
Well, I think it comes down to obviously the main goal of the individual, right? So obviously in that physique competitor, we want to maximize fat-free mass, and we really want to minimize any losses in that, and then we want to maximize the fat loss. And really the one thing that I would say is similar between both populations is that I really try to use cardio as, it's one of the many tools that we have in the toolbox to be able to implement. And I like to start with a slow approach and slowly integrate it over time. So even, at least personally, when I coach competitors in the off season, I'm not personally a fan of them doing, 30, 40, 50 minutes of cardio a day, 5, 6 days a week, because now my threshold of where they're starting is already really high in the off season. So I'd rather keep that almost to a minimum, or we just use it to kind of control caloric expenditure, and then I dose it from there. So ideally, I would say for most of my clients in the off season, if I can minimize the amount of cardio that we have them do, and then slowly program it so that now I can use it as an effective fat loss tool, and just by means of increasing caloric expenditure. So if they go from doing only, say, 30 minutes of aerobic activity a week, or 40 minutes per week in the off season, and then now week 1, we can start with going to 60 minutes a week. And then week 2, we can go to 70 minutes a week. Week 3, we can go to 80, and we moderate that accordingly. And the reason I say that is because specificity of training, we always go back to specific adaptations to implied demands. And what is the purpose? The purpose of our population is not to run a marathon. It's obviously to maximize muscularity. So if we're spending more time doing cardio than we're doing weight training or doing posing, we're doing the wrong thing. And I think that's the biggest thing that we need to keep in mind, is that specificity of training. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that, because people try to just get lean. But it's like, now I'm doing 2 hours of cardio a day and I'm only weight training for 45 minutes. And you brought up a very good point: recovery. How can I perform in the weight room and maintain that fat-free mass?
For sure.
Okay, so Doc, you haven't heard me talk probably before, but I'm a huge context guy. I hate generalization, so I'm always going to provide like 18 layers of context before I make my statement, which Chris is probably getting used to by now. So if I'm looking at your question as a whole, Chris, of like, okay, what would be the approach in terms of both the type and the volume of cardio that I would choose? I'm trying to narrow down that cardio to a goal, because maybe it is just extra calorie expenditure, right? I'm just using it to move the energy deficit. Or maybe I'm actually using it for some sort of physiological stimulus, like for instance, with HIIT training, there's a stronger physiological stimulus that is going to affect things like growth hormone and have a much different effect than low intensity steady state. And when I'm looking at those things, I take into account, like, what am I doing training wise? And I look at, well, what if I'm doing training that's already very metabolic and is going to have a lot of those same physiological things that overlap with HIIT training? Then I have to consider those things as like overlapping volume, like one is adding on top of the other. And in that case, then it becomes a decision. Do I want that? Do I want more of that stimulus, or am I already tapped out there from the resistance training portion of it? And so anything that I do add needs to be low intensity. And so oftentimes, since we're going to favor the physiological benefit of resistance training usually more than cardio, is usually I'm going to do my cardio-based system in a way that is like complementary, but not in addition to what I'm doing in the weight room, with the exception of sometimes, like especially in the terms of context prep or contest prep, when you get a person to the point where all of a sudden we have to start decreasing the resistance training because they're at that point of the calorie deficit and the leanness where we're trying to avoid the inflammation and the mechanical trauma, and so maybe that volume has to come down. Then maybe I use that cardio as maybe a very like concentric, less damaging stimulus, and I can bring the volume of that up, right, in certain places. And the other thing I always look at is, can I nutritionally support this system? So when I look at things mechanistically and what we see in terms of somebody's response to training, is that if you have somebody and carbohydrates are very low or their deficit is very large, their response to HIIT training is more fatiguing, it's more inflammatory, and it has a greater impact on everything from their mood to their performance and force production. So I'm looking at that from a stimulus perspective. It's like, okay, what am I trying to accomplish from a stimulus? Am I accomplishing everything that I need to from the weight training? If not, am I adding on volume, or am I trying to complement this? And is there an overlapping systemic effect between those two things that I need to be considered of? And what I will typically do, if we look at contest prep, or even just like a general person that's going through a transformation, in the beginning, when their diet is a little less strict and maybe their carbohydrates are higher and we're not using as much volume of training, I will actually bias more of my HIIT training there to kind of front load some of those physiological conditioning benefits that come with it, and knowing that they're probably likely to adapt to that better. And also, like, I'm probably not doing as much volume of leg work and stuff at that point in time because they're more in either a learning phase or they're more in a strength pushing. And then as I start to change, I will kind of switch that off. Like, I think the trend tends to be to just crush HIIT towards the contest. And I actually do the opposite, because it's like, when I get close to the contest, they should, like, they're not going to get much of a response to that HIIT training in terms of like a huge physiological push to accelerate fat loss or anything like that. They're just going to get tired. They're going to get inflamed. They're going to get depleted. And so I want to manage that energy balance in a way that disrupts their system as little as possible towards the end, right? And I find that just seems to bring people in a much healthier mental state, less water retention, easier to fill them up, et cetera, et cetera.
Awesome, man. Yeah. So off the points Kasim just made, I take a pretty similar approach where I do favor HIIT cardio a little bit more in the earlier stages of a fat loss phase, whether it's a contest prep or just a transformation phase, just because calories are higher. So I feel like they're able to do more intense output work. And then especially for competitors, once their body fat levels do become extremely low, like let's say for males, like they're touching that 8% and below mark, once they get there, their ability to perform HIIT at a high level is definitely decreased, I guess, because glycogen's depleted, their body fat levels are much lower, and their caloric intake is going to be lower. So from there, that's typically when I start transitioning more into low intensity steady state, but I still do prefer fasted low intensity steady state, especially for competitors. So I think it would be really cool to get everyone's viewpoint on if fasted cardio has any benefits compared to fed in regards to maximizing fat loss, and is there a greater risk of losing muscle mass depending on what type of cardio you're implementing and whether you're fasted or fed. So typically when I do fasted cardio, it's low intensity steady state, but sometimes I do implement a few sprints at the beginning of the session or some sort of high intensity interval training at the beginning of the session, and then finish it off with low intensity steady state. So it can vary there. I think so many things come into play, especially when you consider supplementation as well. But in regards to the fitness industry as a whole and what a lot of evidence-based people recommend, the trends have been 10 years ago, it was HIIT. And now it's basically just make sure you're burning X amount of calories per session. And they don't necessarily favor an intensity, or everyone just going with low intensity steady state because they're saying high intensity interval training is too hard to recover from and it's going to hinder your ability to perform in the gym. So there's so many different angles we can take it. But one other thing I want to address later on is the different types of HIIT cardio, because that's going to massively impact your recovery systems. You can do HIIT cardio that's really acutely demanding, but it's not chronically fatiguing versus other types. So I think we should address that too. I guess let's start with is there any benefit to performing fasted cardio versus fed, or is it just calories burned within one session is all that matters?
Yeah, I think personally, when looking at some of the data, I think we really have to evaluate what the literature shows us, because when you just look at what's available in terms of chronic adaptations to the fasted cardio, you're going to really kind of be left with, you can really only conclude based on what is available that it's really not different. That's what you can conclude. But now when we actually look deeper at the data and now see, okay, how does this apply to that physique competitor? Now we can maybe find some little caveats and see, we really need to maybe interpret it with some caution. And one thing that I find interesting really is, and this has been, I think, over the last few years, is even differentiating fasted into what I call more of a protein enhanced cardio. So basically, you're not providing your body with the glycogen, but you are providing it with a protein source, because some of even the acute studies are very interesting to show that it favors fat oxidation. You increase your overall metabolic rate post exercise when you ingest some sort of food. And I think at the end of the day, the thing is we need to have some more controlled trials to be able to give definitive answers based on experience and based on the information that is currently available. My personal recommendation would be to utilize the protein enhanced version of cardio. So we're not really truly fasted, but we take a small dose of protein, and then we therefore we're able to potentially protect that fat-free mass, and then we're able to see get the benefit of the other components where the glycogen levels are going to be on the lower side. But I think we need to definitely look further and keep an open mind to see if it might be different or better in doing it completely fasted, or even if it matters at all, because there hasn't been a chronic study done in this population for a long period of time.
For sure.
So from a coach's perspective, what I'm going to say is that it looks like we always want that magic thing, right? That's like, well, if you do it this way, oh, it's just so much better. I don't think that we can even, I mean, we can speculate that there's probably maybe some differences, there's some opportunities where one would be advantageous over the other, but I don't think that you can make the case that like, well, this is just physiologically just like has such an advantage, especially without a bunch of individual context. So when I actually look at making decisions like this, it usually comes down on an individual basis and how it's actually going to affect them psychologically and just like, just their routine, their behavior. So that's where it's like, okay, if somebody likes doing that and they just think it works better, then maybe actually you're better off just letting them do that just from the psychological benefit if they think it works better, or it's just mentally easier for them to be done with it. So I think there's a whole bunch of components in there that when we remove somebody from a lab restricted environment and it's like, okay, now these are free humans. They're not slaves to the parameters of this study. They have to make all of these decisions throughout the day consciously to adhere to the things that are going to make them successful. So sometimes the most effective thing is just whatever is going to allow them to be the most successful in their behaviors and decision-making processes and just emotionally throughout that. So that's immediately where I'm probably going to prioritize my decision. If we want to get into the nuance, then what I'm going to say is, all right, well, okay, what are we talking about fasted, right? Because if we look at the local tissues, I have to look at the diet and the training and figure out how much glycogen locally am I going to have? Because ultimately, if we're talking about sparing muscle, you could take protein. I'm gonna say, like, my opinion of that, doc, is going to be that that's not going to be near as significant as just actually having a decent glycogen status in the main drivers of whatever that cardio activity is going to be. Like if I'm going anti-catabolic, I'm going to look at that as the main marker, especially when it comes down to protein. Usually in these people, they're already having to do a bunch of gluconeogenesis and stuff. So their liver is already, getting, hammer fisted, just being in the deficit as is. So I'm not going to try and make any more work for that, especially if I'm trying to reduce bloat and inflammation and help with their mood and their cravings. So I would say if I'm going to do fasted cardio, I'm probably going to try and make sure that that occurs when somebody's likely to have some glycogen in their, in their lower body musculature. But that's about the extent of what I would say in terms of if I would choose that way, how I would handle that from a physiological perspective. And so with your comment, Chris, on sometimes like doing a few sprints, you know, before. I'm assuming that you're wanting to get those catecholamines going to like kind of, you know, get the fatty acids flowing. I see the logic for that, and I see, you know, everything for people that do like the dynamic exercises before to get that. But I don't think that when we're doing fasted cardio, I don't think that the mobilization is ever the limiting factor. Right? So it's like, if I can mobilize a bunch of fatty acids, but it's in excess of what I'm going to be burning during that fasted cardio, it really doesn't matter. So if I'm going into that state of fasted cardio and I start doing my activity, the cells are going to start transporting those fatty acids as needed. They're not just going to take up more because you happen to do some dynamic sprints or some jumps or whatever beforehand. So when I'm looking at that, I'm like, was that necessary? Was that just an increased neurological stress? I don't know, maybe there's a psychological benefit to just like somebody's training fast cardio in the morning and that just kind of wakes them up and gets them a little bit more energetic. Maybe they actually will get a little bit more output just because of the actual neurological stimulus they get from that. So there could be a benefit, but I don't think it's going to be like on the physiological, like how much fat are we burning, unless somehow that manages to improve their output in that session. Because I don't think the mobilization of the fat for low intensity is ever going to be the rate limiter in terms of how much fat am I burning in that case. I don't know if you disagree, Doc, but I feel happy.
Well, one thing that I wanted to say with regards to the protein, what is your take on, let's say you had your last meal at 9 p.m., 9 p.m., and let's say that you are going to do that fasted cardio at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. So, and let's say that you took a slow digesting protein before you went to bed. Let's say at 9 p.m. you had some sort of a case of slow digesting protein. So now you've gone through the whole night. You know, that slow digesting protein might take 4, 5, 6 hours to really kind of mobilize. So when you wake up, you're discussing about protein not being effective, but what is your reasoning for thinking that it wouldn't be?
Well, if I'm saying like if the goal is at this point we're trying to be in an anti-catabolic state in regards to protein, and when I look at things on the cellular level, glycogen seems to be the most important thing when we're looking at like what is going to affect whether or not during this activity I go into a muscle wasting or a protein catabolic state, right? Is whether or not I have a efficient fuel source right here. And so if I'm doing a low intensity activity, that's definitely going to be my main driver. Now, if we're talking about anabolism, that's a totally different thing, right? It's okay. There's definitely a threshold of amino acids I need to build up and whatever. But I think people confuse the fact that like we need to have protein, like we need to have these amino acids floating around in our blood to not be anti-catabolic. Because yeah, there's certain processes that the body needs to use, you know, proteins for other than simply creating energy. But if we're talking about like, okay, I get up, I go do my cardio. If I'm going and I'm doing my fasted cardio, I'm like my liver's not going to be doing a bunch of activities and stuff that are going to be very protein driven at that point. So I think it's a stretch to say that we need protein right there to prevent the muscle wasting. I think if there is an issue of muscle wasting, it's going to be I'm asking energy demand of a tissue that doesn't have glucose as a substrate. And so therefore I'm going to catabolize more protein that way. And when I look physiologically of how everything works in terms of like, okay, the liver is kind of our body's natural glucose bank, right? So when I don't have enough locally, that's who's going to keep the blood sugar up. That converting protein into a carbohydrate, that's a calorie loss or energy loss process. So when somebody's, you know, got a lot of fat to lose and they're eating relatively high amount of calories, that's one of the reasons that like this lactic training and stuff can be so beneficial in terms of like post exercise, like, you know, energy expenditure, et cetera. But in the case of low intensity and very low calories, I'm less likely to want to stress that system anymore, because I know that if they're in a significant deficit or their body fat's really lean, that system's kind of getting churned all day long. And I see that, you know, in terms of a, like just anecdotally, that seems to be a much better driver for helping somebody maintain lean mass and performance, is actually using carbohydrates as the anti-catabolic rather than trying to use protein as the anti-catabolic. I've even gone as far as doing what we have coined carbio, where we've actually given people people will just like, they'll just grow horns and shoot lasers out of their eyes when they hear this, but like, yeah, I have actually given intra-cardio carbohydrates in some instances for certain individuals, because it's like, I'm trying to decrease the amount of systemic stress, and by that mainly the liver, and so I'm going to decrease how much of that needs to be done so that we can just focus on expending some energy locally at the, you know, whatever tissues happen to be propelling the movement, without adding stress onto the thing that basically needs to help you manage your blood sugar all day long while you're in your deficit. So
the perspective I see Doc sharing is those that are in calorie deficits are in fat loss phases, especially contest preppers. We understand that their glycogen levels are going to be low, but it seems like Kasim is stating, let's provide them with the fuel source so that let's provide them with glucose so they can efficiently perform the cardiovascular work. And Doc is saying, I don't care about how well we perform the endurance exercise because we're bodybuilders. We're using the cardio to oxidize more fat. So I think Doc's perspective is, let's provide them with amino acids via protein feeding, not as a fuel source, but not as a fuel source to drive cardio performance or to enable them to perform the cardio well, but as a safety blanket, so that whatever fuel source is being utilized during that time, if we are going to utilize amino acids at all, hopefully it comes from the plasma rather than, you know, skeletal muscle tissue. Would you say something like that, Doc? Or
yeah, I would agree that it's more of a safety, because it might be, let's call it, if we call it an insurance policy, it might be an insurance policy that doesn't pay out. But I think just looking at the logistically, for me, it just makes sense to, if we haven't provided the body with the protein and the amino acids, why not provide that first thing in the morning to go into a positive nitrogen balance and to increase increase muscle protein synthesis, because even though I agree, carbohydrates are definitely critical and they play different roles, and it will definitely, when you have the carbohydrates, it's not going to necessarily increase muscle protein synthesis, but it'll prevent muscle protein breakdown, and they do work synergistically. So I definitely understand that component of it. So for me, and again, just based on some of the acute studies that have been done, if looking at, if we feed you maltodextrin versus we feed you protein, we're going to have a higher increase in metabolic rate just by giving you protein compared to the maltodextrin. Of course, there hasn't been other sources of carbohydrate that I'm aware of that they've looked at acutely. But that would be another interesting maybe thing to look at. So if I know that I'm going to now see an increase in metabolic rate, and I'm going to see an increase in excess post-oxygen consumption at the end of that cardio session, now at the end of the day, for fat loss, we want to just create a caloric deficit, right? And all of these little things are going to add up to maybe increasing the caloric deficit by an extra 50 calories, 30 calories, 40 calories. And now if you add that over the course of 5 days, 7 days, now you created a much larger deficit without really doing anything different than if you were doing it the other way.
Yeah. First thing for everybody listening, this is extremely nuanced stuff. So don't be like, wow, like I got to do it this way and that'll be 3,000% better than the other way. So, because I mean, we're splitting hairs at this point, right?
Absolutely.
You know, and you could make the argument that maybe it's somewhere in between, that it's a little bit of carbs and it's a little bit of protein. We could draw up like a bunch of, this is where context is so important. It's like, could you paint me a scenario where this the protein would absolutely be the better choice, especially if you crunch a window of time in there, and you absolutely could, and then vice versa. So a couple things that I'll comment on that, just because I like to nerd out on this stuff. So if you don't like nerding out on this stuff, just tune out right now. Is so when I'm looking at, all right, carbs versus protein, what's going to happen? So I know that if I give somebody, you know, the same calorie equivalent of protein as I do carbohydrate, especially if we're looking at some of that is going to be used as a fuel source, not all of it, but some of it, that I know that like the total energy balance is going to be less. The protein takes more work to digest, right? If we're converting it into glucose, we're losing energy right there. So it is a greater energy deficit by that mechanism alone. And so if you look at it in that snapshot of time, you can absolutely say, sure, if I were to take 20 grams of protein instead of 20 grams of carbs before this cardio, and those are just random numbers, 20 is just the first number that popped in my head, right? Is that, yeah, you would measure a greater energy expenditure utilizing the 20 grams of protein, because technically you're just getting less energy, you know, period. And if you are going to try and convert that into any glucose, there's more energy loss. Now, when I'm looking at this outside of that window of time, right? So if like, okay, I'm looking at, all right, if an athlete is stressed, if the deficit is more of a stress, am I better off trying to get that energy deficit that I'm looking for done here, or would I rather have them eat 30 less calories throughout the day and make this cardio experience a little less stressful? That's kind of where I'm looking at, well, what was the net effect? Because then you have all the things, it's like, okay, if I'm doing this 5 times a week, how does that start affecting my sleep and all these other things? So when I'm looking at imposing this cardio on somebody and I'm looking at what's the strategy that I'm going to use, I'm trying to see it outside of that window as well. Because if we isolate everything we do to just what's happening acutely, we miss how their body is responding to that, like the majority of the time that they're, you know, the majority of the day, right? So if what good does it do if I chip away like an extra 30 calories of cardio, but all of a sudden their sleep starts deteriorating, or their mood starts getting worse, you know, or they start having more cravings and then they binge 500 calories. It's like, well, cool. Those 30 calories don't really mean anything now, right? So that's one of the reasons that I kind of look, I look a little bit more globally at these things. And that's just, you know, that's just a coaching experience thing that I've kind of worked out anecdotally, just tracking a bunch of stuff. And it seems to, I can explain it with the mechanism. Doesn't mean that mechanism is right. Who knows? Like in 10 years, all the mechanisms will be different anyway. But that story does seem to play out. And then the other thing, when we look at how anti-catabolic protein or carbohydrate is, when we're looking at the governing of what's going on in that cell, right? It's AMPK and mTOR kind of like, you know, tugging away at this gradient on what's going to be used as a fuel source, how much fat and glucose is going to be pulled in or whatever. And AMPK is going to out signal mTOR all the time in these conditions, because it's the primary thing is the cell needs to have fuel, right? So it doesn't matter if the cell has excess amino acids, if it is in a cellular energy balance that says we need more fuel, it's gonna catabolize whatever is there. And so this easiest way to kind of help buffer that is to make sure that we have enough glucose to the liver and enough glucose locally. I think that's my argument. And we're splitting hairs here. I think in a perfect world, I would give a little bit of both, right? I would have somebody maybe take like a few grams of EAAs and maybe just a little bit of carbs if I thought they needed it. Oftentimes in this case, what I would do is I would actually give fruit before bed, so that the following morning their liver glycogen was a little bit higher, meaning going into the session it would be able to contribute a little bit more before it started getting stressed. But you know, every individual is a little bit different. But what I'm always trying to somehow accomplish is that I'm minimizing any unnecessary stress that comes from that cardio, in relationship to the benefit that I get in the calorie expenditure or the metabolic adaptations or whatever it may be. It's just, you're always kind of trying to find the way of how do I get the most positive effect with the least negative effect. And we could sit here and go back and forth on like 50 different scenarios. And I think it's important for people to understand that what you need is going to be somewhere on a gradient. That would be my final.
Well, I agree 100% that looking at the big picture is very important sometimes. And I think a lot of evidence-based practitioners focus so much on that acute window. And I think we shouldn't disregard it. We should take it into account. But more importantly, we need to look at the global effect of what's going on. And you hit the nail on the head earlier when we opened this part of the discussion, and I think is the individual variability and what's going to work for the person, because the number one thing that we need is adherence. And that's very important. Sometimes people feel very accomplished, if they have a very busy work schedule and they generally maybe lift in the afternoon, the only time they may have to do that cardio is going to be that first thing in the morning or when they first get up, and it vice versa. It may be something where they can only do it at the end of the night, and doing it fasted is not going to work for them. So adherence is going to be the most important thing to what's going to work for the individual. And I think looking at the big picture, at the end of the day, to create that deficit, what do we need? And that's we need to be consistent on obviously controlling the consumption and controlling the expenditure. The other component that I think gets lost is sometimes people do so much work in the cardio and everything else, and they're putting all this time in the weight room, and they end up becoming less active. So now their non-exercise activity thermogenic plummets way down, and they're more physically active in the gym and doing their cardio. Their deficit is amazing, but now they used to do this much NEAT and now they're doing this much NEAT. So really it's kind of like you said, you didn't go anywhere now. So you increase more calorie expenditure by working out harder, doing this HIIT stuff, increasing your volume in the weight room. But now outside of that, you just sit on your butt all day. And I'm guilty as charged. I know when I'm in contest prep, if I'm not mentally focused, literally, I will not move most of the day. I move much slower. I try to sit down more. Do I want to go to the grocery store? No. Am I going to fight for the closest parking spot? Absolutely. Can I find a handicap sticker? If I can, I will, because I want to use it, because I don't want to move. And that makes it really hard. So and then you think, wow, I'm not losing any more body fat, but yeah, your body is just self-conserving. It's like it's trying not to move anymore to conserve that energy. So I think that's the big picture approach, which I really like that idea that we forget about.
Yeah, it's not very good when people get in that mindset. It's where they're standing there eating a donut trying to decide whether they should choose sugar-free gum. Right? Take care of the big stuff, the important stuff, right?
Exactly.
For sure. I guess one question I want to pose, I'm always utilizing cardio, at least for bodybuilders. I'm not too concerned about how well they're performing that cardio session. I really do try to utilize it as a tool to either increase fat oxidation acutely and maximize it then and there, or what kind of metabolic effect is it going to have post training. Cassim, when you're utilizing, like if you were to utilize carbohydrates for a low intensity or even medium intensity steady state session, is that just to improve their performance of that cardio training?
No, it's mitigating, like, pros and cons, right? Okay. Is what it is. So we'll say this way: it's about improving stimulus, but not necessarily the external performance.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So that's so it's like, it's not like I'm giving somebody carbs like I would an intra-workout weight session where I'm trying to increase their tolerance to volume or whatever. It's like I'm just trying to decrease the stress impact on this, right? And potentially mitigate downstream stresses like the drops in NEAT and stuff that you will see especially when somebody gets a little bit more systemically stressed. So we're talking like, you know, fairly insignificant amounts when we would, like what people think of intra-workout carbohydrates, and they're doing, you know, 60, 100 grams. We're talking like, okay, maybe like in the 10 to 15 gram range, or having some fruit before bed as your carbohydrate source or something like that, to just bring up some liver glycogen, like getting a little bit more fructose. These are, and again, these things only really have any magnitude of difference when you're getting to that point where, okay, I'm really lean, and now it's like every little thing kind of counts. Every little thing is just one domino that is going to affect my energy and my recovery and all this other stuff. So that's really what it is. It's about, how do I make sure that I get the stimulus and just mitigate any negatives that come along with that, right? But it's not, okay, cool, today we were able to go at, you know, 4.2 miles per hour instead of 3.8, or it's not an external performance factor at all. But I will say that I think sometimes because people feel better,
Yeah.
they do, as a byproduct, have a little bit better external performance.
Cool. So maybe we can shift gears and talk about how we can program cardio in to improve recovery and or at least mitigate any sort of the negatives that you're talking about, right? So maybe we can talk about certain high intensity interval training techniques can be way too systemically fatiguing or even locally fatiguing. They create too much muscle damage, whereas you can utilize a different technique that is going to be primarily concentric muscle actions. It's not going to really lead to soreness the next day. And it might be a better tool for some people listening to implement in their current regimen.
Yeah, I think part of periodizing that into the training is very important, because, you know, let's say you have, as you said, leg sessions are going to be the ones where you're going to take the most beating on. So, you know, if you have a leg day on a Monday and a Friday, and then now you're doing some HIIT training on maybe on Sunday and Thursday, well, that might not be ideal, right? Because you don't have enough time to recover from that. So you have to kind of figure out, you know, where can you space it within there so that you can get adequate recovery. And I think that's the biggest part that you have to take into consideration when you're working with people. And that's why for me, the high intensity stuff, I like what was stated earlier, that I think you really have to kind of balance it out with the rest of your training. And if you're going to maybe decrease some of the your volume in the weight room, then at that point in time, maybe increase some of that high intensity interval training, because it's going to, it kind of makes sense. I mean, the weight room is high intensity activity. And I think that does make sense to me. But I think if you try to overload both systems, then you're going to get to the point of now you're going to be fighting other components for recovery.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that I will use things. You know, like you said, do we want to go to concentric dominant activities? And that's where things like swapping out, say you're doing a superset, you know, and you were going to do like hack squat leg extension or just something like that, but swapping out that second exercise for a sled push or a few seconds on a bike or something where it's concentric only basically activity. That's one way of like, okay, I'm still working at a high enough intensity that it's like it's contributing to volume of this resistance training session, but it's doing it in a way that's reducing some of the mechanical, you know, trauma. So it's like I'm achieving what I wanted to from a metabolic stimulus, because, you know, sometimes that's the way we're training in the weight room. Like it is, it's dense, it's high paced, it's higher. It's like it's metabolic training with weights. And as we get somebody to the point where, you know, they have less to recover with from a nutritional perspective or whatever, that's where it's like sometimes you can kind of almost like blend these things together. It's like, well, things that I would associate with HIIT training, whether that be a bike interval, a sled push, or, you know, whatever it may be, those things almost can get worked into even in the weight sessions as a way of just kind of swapping out volume of one for the other in a way that maybe is going to improve somebody's recovery. And I think I'm missing the first part of your question there. But the other thing that I'll look at in terms of whether or not I'm going to utilize HIIT and at what intensity within that. We talked about the beginning is that, you know, we want to get that stuff in when we have more nutrition and we're able to deal with it better. But when we think about just the way overall conditioning affects our recovery, I think especially like meatheads that have been like, you know, hypertrophy, I pick things up and lift things hard, is they don't understand how much the conditioning side affects their recovery, how much it affects their tolerance to volume, simply because you know, they can mobilize fuel better, right? Their respiration is better, their local energy is better. Like, so the thing that allows me to have, you know, more tolerance to volume is not just my ability to deal with the mechanical stress, it's my ability to regain energy homeostasis in between sets, right? And it's also my ability to then create enough energy to, you know, go through that adaptation process, but not have it be an extra stressor on my system. So like when we look at, for instance, the autonomic nervous system, if you're in better shape, it's easier to get back to a parasympathetic state after a high intensity lifting session because you can get to energy homeostasis faster. And I think that's hugely overlooked, not just in prep, but just in people that are just, you know, training for hypertrophy or physique goals in general, is underestimating how important it is to maintain a certain level of both global and local conditioning as a source of, well, I can just perform and recover better, right? And so I like the, you know, the first thing Doc said was periodization, and that's, you know, that's what I look at when we're using these higher intensity techniques. Is really, I don't like use them throughout. I periodize them in and kind of block. So it's because usually I'm doing the opposite, or a synergistic thing with the training protocol. But when I'm looking at, you know, creating a periodization for somebody, I'm always looking at how can what I'm doing now, how can I potentiate the performance and the recovery of what I want to do next? And oftentimes there will be like metabolic based stuff or conditioning based stuff that maybe I can fit into here that is going to improve my recovery and my tolerance to volume in the subsequent phases. And I think so many people in the physique world walk around feeling like crap and getting really suboptimal results because they're just out of shape, right? I mean, they're really strong, you know, and they can take a lot of pre-workout and be a madman in the gym, but then outside of those like couple hours, like there's no beast mode outside of like that little that little window, right? It's like,
For sure. Yeah, I think like for example, today I got all excited about this cardio talk. So I did wing gates this morning for the first time since 2017. So to say the least,
how many to do, Chris? How many to do?
I did 4 12-second sprints at 10% body weight on the wing gate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
With 48 seconds rest, and it was a lot harder than I remembered it to be, basically because I was in much better cardiovascular shape back then. My conditioning was way better, but it is super important to implement that into your training just in general, because I do realize, you know, if I do a set of 15 on hack squat, it takes me so long to recover in between sets. Whereas if I utilize high intensity interval training and do a little bit more metabolic work as cardio, it's going to improve my ability to recover in between sets when I'm actually resistance training and focused on my hypertrophy training. So it is something that I want to implement back in. I think a lot of people program their cardio without really thinking about it because they're just trying to burn X amount of calories. So, you know, somebody like, for example, let's say you're training legs in the PM. I don't even know if I would recommend any cardio whatsoever for that particular client. I guess context is obviously going to be super important to understand. But for example, if you were to do like high intensity interval training in the AM, when you know you have legs in the PM, if you're doing something that's going to deplete your glycogen from that tissue that you're going to be training later on, I mean, you can basically guarantee you're going to have a really shitty training session later. So maybe in that situation, you definitely want to, you know, preference some low intensity steady state instead of something that's going to be really glycogen dependent, you know? So maybe we can just share some practical applications in regards to when one might be better than the other, or how you guys kind of just work with clients in regards to if there's an upper end of how much cardio someone is doing. Is there a certain point where you just won't allow food intake to go any lower, so you're going to continuously increase work output, or vice versa? Would you rather, like feed them more and work them more, or feed them less and not have them do more output? I know I kind of threw out a lot, but just trying to put some ideas out there of some other things we can touch on.
This was supposed to be one question at a time, dude. You got like 5 or 6 at a time.
That's my bad. I mean, we could go with any of them, just some ideas off the top.
Well, one of the first ones, I'm going to kind of go on the last one that you answered, and something sparked an idea related to the last topic, but I'll discuss on that in a second. But with regards to, how low can we go on the calories? And personally, because people only have so much time a day, again, it's going to be based on the individual. Some people they don't mind spending, 4, 5, 6 hours a day doing stuff. But I've taken the approach over the last few years where I would rather just feed them a little bit less and keep the output, to a tolerable level. That way that's sustainable. Because then I'm going to, in terms of recovery and everything else, inflammation, injury prevention, I think I'm going to be doing more benefit at that point in time rather than just work more. So I definitely like to leave a lot of room, and that's how I like to do the cardio. Like I said earlier, I don't like to slam you with a ton of cardio at the beginning, because if I start you with 3 hours of cardio a week, week 1 on a 20-week prep, what's going to happen when I'm 18 weeks in? I'm going to have to, that's my baseline. And then now I have to really do 6 hours, 9 hours, 12 hours, which is just way too much cardio a day. But one thing that sparked my brain a little bit earlier with regards to the conditioning, which is very important, because I agree with both of you guys, we do need to be in shape. And I think the way I like to sometimes integrate some of my conditioning is just doing it in the weight room. And I think you actually alluded to that a little bit earlier, as implementing some of that conditioning in the actual weight room, in the weight training session. And that way you can still get the metabolic conditioning. So maybe you start with more of your hypertrophy based type, maybe a little bit longer rest periods, still building some strength and hypertrophy implemented at the beginning, but maybe you spend another 10, 15 minutes toward the end of your session, still doing resistance training, but doing it more in metabolic conditioning type of factors. And I think that's a great way to do it. We can still be in shape and still get the metabolic conditioning without necessarily having to do a Wingate or having to go to the track and do sprints. So you can get the best of both worlds. Not to say that the other ones are bad ideas as well, but I think part of it is going to be, what's the person going to adhere to?
For sure.
So I'll start with the, what's my checklist for somebody to be able to do HIIT, right? Because I think that's probably what's going to be helpful for most people. And when I look at HIIT versus, and obviously there's different types of HIIT, but basically if I'm doing high intensity, or even high-ish intensity, because I know there's this dogma that if you don't get an eyelid vein, that it's not really HIIT, right? So even though it's just energy system training at one point or another, whether we make it a 10-second sprint or a 60-second sprint or whatever for the individual. Okay, soapbox rant over. So my checklist for that is that if I'm going to do HIIT, it means that I'm looking directly for that physiological stimulus that comes from HIIT. Otherwise, low intensity would be better because it's less of a disruption for my system. And the other two is because I know that, basically the majority of the positive physiological outcomes that come from HIIT, a lot of them happen from just burning through all that glucose, right? And creating, there's research both directions on the actual effect of the lactic acid metabolite, but we do know it is that system, right? That we need that abrupt stress, which is largely fueled by glucose. So doesn't mean I can't be in a calorie deficit, but I'm not going to be doing it on a keto diet, right? I'm going to be giving them the fuel source that supports that. Because when it comes to HIIT training, again, it's not the external performance, but they need a certain amount of performance. Like they need to be able to create a certain amount of metabolite to be able to have that systemic effect. And I've had plenty of people, I don't know if you've gone through this, Doc, but plenty of people earlier in my career where we've put them on a lactic style program or have them do HIIT. And it almost seems like to them, they perceive it as like, oh, this is easier or whatever. And then what you realize is like, it's because they're not burning any glucose. Like you actually look, their performance is crap, but they perceived it as easy because they didn't make any metabolite, right? And so you would see people go through the system and like it's not working like it's supposed to. They think it's a breeze and I just keep making it harder, and it really doesn't matter because their performance just kind of stays the same. And it's like, but then all of a sudden you throw a bunch of glucose at them, and then they're like, oh, my quads are just on fire now. And then you would see the, what you would expect from the physiological response. And so I think when people do HIIT, understanding that you have to fuel that physiological process in order to get the positive adaptations. Otherwise, sure, you're burning more calories per minute, while you're on it, but you might not be getting any more benefit. You're just doing a more stressful level of that, right? And if it's, that's like saying, well, okay, we might as well go CrossFit now and just have you do rounds of snatches or something like that. Let's really stress out your body for minimal, for minimal gain. So I'm looking at, I'm shooting for that stimulus. That is the goal of the cardio. And that usually means like we're trying to get everything that comes along with that from the conditioning perspective, from the growth hormone based perspective, the local, the local conditioning of the lower body. And I'm able to fuel that process. Okay. And so that means whatever I'm doing in training has to allow for that, either in volume of stimulus, or I'm training something like a lot of times I will train the absolute opposite. So say I'm running a block where somebody's doing like heavy loads, long rest, like they're doing more strength type work. And so the metabolic demand is very low. So in that case, it's like, well, cool. As long as I periodize these sessions away from your lower body stuff, I can get 1 to 3 of these high intensity sessions in there and bring up your conditioning in a way that isn't really going to have a negative impact on your strength-based training, especially if we're talking about somebody's strength training for Zeke, not strength training for like powerlifting or whatnot, right? And then the other things that I will do in terms of like incorporating it with weight training and stuff like that. So most people are probably familiar with, peripheral heart method or GBC training, where we're doing like upper lower body supersets and all of that stuff that's conditioning. That will be kind of like if I'm training weights metabolically, it'd be those things. And then if we need to, swapping volume. What I don't like to do is trying to achieve too many stimuli within the same session, because there's a lot of competition in terms of substrate and being able to recover. So and you're probably familiar with this model, Chris, the old model of like, okay, I do some heavy work and then I do some hypertrophy work and then I do some more metabolic stuff towards the end. In my experience, that's actually the hardest system to recover from and provides the worst results. So I will usually, if I'm going to try and do like strength work and like HIIT or some sort of metabolic work, I'm going to try and make sure I separate them so that I don't have to try and recover from both of those things. And when we're talking in the context of contest prep, then you can kind of look at it as like, well, my strength work is really just kind of like anti-atrophy work at this point in time, right? It's like it's a maintenance amount of tension to prevent muscle loss. Then that's maybe in a different context when we kind of get in there. But when we look at people that are maybe, towards the beginning of their transformation, or maybe they're trying to, stay in shape while they're just, focusing on hypertrophy or other goals, I don't like to get too greedy and try and achieve everything in a single session. I prefer to have blocks where it's like, okay, I'm going to get somebody in really good shape, and then we're going to focus more on that hypertrophy range. And then as they start to get out of shape, then I'm going to periodize back in something to get them in shape again. Because there's also some positives to being less adapted to some of these stresses, because it means that we can get adaptations out of less stress. But I find from a recovery standpoint, the hardest thing to recover is what I call like the kitchen sink protocol, where we're trying to put all of the stimuli in the single session, with the exception of when it's such a low volume that it's just like, I'm doing a little bit of high tension work just to like maintain some muscle mass, and then I'm doing metabolic on top of that, just to kind of separate those two.
Cool. Yeah, we're like at our hour mark. I don't know, is there any other things we want to dive down?
I don't have anything that comes to mind, so it's up to you.
I'll pose another one.
Sure.
So Doc, you're talking about how, and this is the model I see the most, like, you know, you pick a certain amount of cardio that you're starting with, and that's like your baseline, and you're going to be able to progress from that. Do you ever, with the resistance training, like end up kind of like going up and down? Because what I'll typically do is, like, the way I'm periodizing the training, depending on how metabolic that is, I don't necessarily do a linear progression of cardio volume. It's more of a, like, it's kind of like, well, the cardio volume corresponds to the weight training that I'm doing there. And so I may have a high amount here and then a low amount and then go back up. And so it's not one of these approaches, because I'm kind of taking it into consideration with the training and really, you know, flipping the stimuluses a lot. That's kind of the way that we work, is we do a lot of like instead of, a lot of people look like they'll look at a long block of training, and what I'll say is like, my long blocks of training are kind of like, you know, they're a bunch of like little cycles where it's kind of like, I occasionally come back and I'll do like a week or two where we're really going after those conditioning benefits, and then maybe we do 4 or 6 weeks where we're using more low intensity or whatnot, and maybe there's some linear progression within that. But then when I leave that and go back to high intensity, maybe bring their carbs back up for a period of time, it allows me to then come back down to a lower volume than what I was at a couple weeks ago, and kind of go through that. And that's kind of the approach that I use. I don't know if maybe you've played around with those approaches and seen any pros, cons.
Well, I think the main approach, even though I think I probably presented it as a linear, and I think for the most part, it'll probably look that way for most people, but I definitely adjusted, because again, I'm going to kind of go back to my first point, which is I literally use cardio as one of the many tools to create the deficit. So it's going to depend on how is that individual progressing. You know, is it impacting? At the end of the day, the last thing I want is the cardio to impact their weight training. So if I would rather give them a little less food and not impact their weight training and have them do less cardio than have it be the other way around, where I'm feeding them the same amount of food, and to create a deficit, I'm going to have to do more and more cardio. So I kind of, you know, use a little bit of, it's kind of a checks and balance system. And as long as what I'm looking at is what's that physique looking like, and then what are some of my objective numbers looking like. So obviously I'm visually looking at the individual, and then of course I do you know, assessments typically every 2 to 4 weeks, and I don't use that as an absolute number. I use it as a, you know, what's the relative change, because obviously there are limitations in body compositions, but whatever body composition device I'm using, it might be an ultrasound, it might be a DEXA, whatever the case may be, then I use that as what's the relative change. So they started at this percentage, you know, how did they change? Did we hit a plateau? And that's why, and that's how I now differentiate and make adjustments as necessary. And some of them, I think you're right on. Some of the people I might start with, you know, I might implement quite a bit of cardio, and all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, like we're losing way too fast, or like we lost way too much fat-free mass. So now I might say, no, we need to increase our calories a little bit more. We need to maybe tone down some of that aerobic exercise, or vice versa. I might be working with another individual, and all of a sudden I see, wow, like we're not where we need to be. So what's going on? And again, I'm going to use that cardio very cautiously, because my main focus is going to be working on how much calories are they taking in, and how much of a deficit am I creating. And I'm only using the cardio as that deficit. One other thing that I've been interested to look at, to kind of go on a little bit of a tangent, is sometimes we look at just cardio, but as physique competitors, we forget that the most important part of what we have to do is actually pose and present on stage. And we have to practice that component of it. And that also requires caloric expenditure. So one of the recent things I've actually talked to Chris about potentially doing in sometime in the near future is actually looking at what's the caloric expenditure of an actual posing session, like going through a 10, 15, 20-minute posing session. How many calories do we burn when we're doing this? And of course, there's going to be some individual differences, but we can maybe kind of chart that and look and see some of that. And then also, what's the excess post-oxygen consumption of some of these? Because now, if I'm looking at the big picture and my goal is creating a caloric deficit, why not create a caloric deficit in a sport-specific fashion? And that's going to be posing, right? Because they actually have to pose. So why have them be doing the bike for all this time? Not to say that they can't do the bike, but why not invest some of that time doing something that they're going to have to do anyway? And in fact, if they're practicing it and it's going to be part of their judging and everything else, now you can actually implement that. So that's another way, again, that we can maybe see if we can implement another way to get the caloric expenditure.
That's an awesome point you make, Doc. Yeah, something I've done with some clients is, let's just say they're resistance training 5 days a week for the majority of their prep, and just keeping things relatively general. Let's just say they're doing low intensity, steady state on their off days. I would, like, in a linear fashion, something that's truly linear is how much posing they're doing as they're getting closer to the show. And, you know, they might start at 8-minute posing sessions X amount of times per week when they're, 12 weeks out. And then it goes from 8 minutes to 10 minutes, and then 10 minutes to 12 minutes, and then 12 minutes to 15 minutes. And then they're increasing their frequency too. So I think it's a great tool to increase energy expenditure. And for those specific athletes, do something so specific that is going to prepare them for the stage better than any other form of exercise really would. So yeah, I think that's an awesome point. I would love to kind of investigate that down the road and see what we can do there.
So the main thing I got from that is that we need to start a business venture called tread posing, where you pose while walking on the treadmill, right? You've heard of Troga, right? The treadmill yoga. So now we just need treadmill posing. I think it could be a thing. Right away.
We'll try to get some investors ASAP.
Yeah, I'm really glad that Doc went back to that whole, deciding whether or not to use food versus cardio for the deficit. I think it's been brought up like 3 or 4 times, but I think that's a huge thing for people to take away, is understanding which one of those two things is going to be a more adherable and less stressful solution to your energy balance thing. And that's not just cardio, that's versus all physical activity expenditure. And for those people that want to dive deeper and kind of look at this stuff, it's going to vary a lot by individual, because like if you're a 105-pound bikini competitor versus a 240-pound bodybuilder, right? There's a big difference in how systemically you deal with physical activity, because like your muscle to like frame and organ ratio is very, very different. And I honestly think this is one of the biggest mistakes. If you could give me a guy like a big Ramy, right? I would not, like, his last 4 weeks, like I would prefer to put him in a coma, right? And it's like, let's have you make the least amount of systemic stress possible, because you just have so much muscle tissue. I think there's a point in diminishing returns where when you get so much muscle tissue, it even just gets harder to oxygenate, that trying to then use more physical output to be the driver for the energy balance equation starts to become very detrimental to your system as a whole, especially as your body fat levels get very, very low. But if you have a very low muscle to frame ratio, you might be able to get by with using more physical activity, because when you do a bicep curl, it doesn't really do so much. But, when, Rami does a bicep curl, or more importantly, probably a leg extension, right? Like there's like a well in some third world country that gets dried by how much water his quad sucks up. So it's a huge, huge difference in the ratio of like, okay, how many calories am I burning versus how much stress am I imposing on my system, and understanding, okay, which is a better solution for me to cut another 50 calories or 100 calories? Is it adding activity in any way, shape, or form, or is it reducing that out of the diet? And I think that, even though this is just a cardio equation, this is usually where it comes down, because people always want to ask, oh, I'm not losing. Do I need to add? Do I need to subtract? This is where really understanding the nutritional component is, where am I at in terms of how my food is affecting somebody physiologically, in terms of how much micronutrition am I able to get to them, how well am I able to fuel their system and just keep them where they need to be, and then deciding what's the best solution here. Do I have room to bring down food, or is that going to compromise me on an essential macronutrients and micronutrients level? Or am I already kind of like getting a little crazy because I'm just not getting enough of the things I need? Then maybe it's a little bit more of an activity base. But it maybe somebody's still got, they got plenty of room on the diet before it becomes that restrictive, then maybe that's a less stressful way. And we could get into context, but I think it's kind of a golden egg for people that's like, hey, this is something to take and investigate further, or just to be very cognizant of, is that before you add any cardio, weigh whether or not that's actually the appropriate decision for shifting your energy balance.
Yeah, I think to add to that a little bit, I definitely agree. One of the ways that I like to see is, I much prefer for a client, or even myself, when I'm getting ready, if I can do little to no cardio the last 2 or 3 weeks before the show, because I've given myself plenty of time and I'm not rushing to get those last few pounds of body fat off, man, it makes, we talked about stress levels, we talked about inflammation levels, we talked about, so all of the hormonal things going on. Your body's already fighting. If you're down to close to that essential fat, your body's already going to be fighting against you anyway, right? Your thyroid levels are going to be down, your TSA levels are going to be down, your testosterone levels are going to be down, your you name it, it's going to be upside down, and it's going to be far away from homeostasis. So the more you add training variables and more cardio and more of these that you have to do, I think the worse it is for you. So I think part of that take-home message is giving yourself that enough time. Sometimes it's the inevitable. If you have a client and they're 2 weeks out and they have to, there's nothing you can do but just kind of push the envelope. But ideally, use it as a learning experience, so that when you're working with that individual again, or when you're working with yourself again, it's like, okay, last time I gave myself 16 weeks, maybe give yourself 20 or 22 weeks. And then now when you're like 3 or 4 weeks out, like, you're good to go. And then now you can actually, much like periodizing or peaking for any other performance, a marathoner doesn't do a 26-mile run the week before his race. He starts to taper the training. And I think in physique competition, if you do it perfectly, and it's really hard, the last couple of weeks, you're kind of coasting in rather than trying to make up for lost ground.
Yeah, I like to use the term sleep into the show. Right?
Yeah.
Like that would be the goal, right? It's like, okay, you're in shape, you're like 2 weeks out, it's like, cool, you're going to take a really long nap with just like an IV, and you're just going to wake up and get on stage, right? Like, perfect. That would be it. Just sleep off the last 1% of fat, and then we're good.
That's awesome, man. Yeah. So I guess for everyone listening, obviously context is key. It's going to really drive. It should be driving your decision making in regards to what you're going to be able to sustain. What do you actually prefer? And when it comes to cardio, again, make sure you're utilizing it as a tool. If you're someone that's working in an extremely physically active, demanding job, you're not, you shouldn't be programming in a ton of cardio right off the bat, if any at all, throughout prep. I've worked with some people that do construction, or have even, they do landscaping. They're not doing any cardio because they're literally burning calories all day long. So in that situation, it's like, how can we optimize their nutrition before they actually resistance train so they can just have good training sessions, because they're just fatigued from all the physical activity they're already doing. The last thing you need to tell someone in that particular situation is like, you have to do fasted cardio because fasted cardio is the key, or you have to do high intensity intervals because high intensity intervals is the key. It's really important to take that into consideration. Whereas, you know, if you're someone that has an office job and you're sitting at a desk all day, and the only physical activity you're really doing is your 60 to 90 minutes of weight training, you're probably going to have to utilize more cardio throughout that prep, especially just because your need is so low. So definitely think about the big picture and utilize cardio as the best tool. And I hope everyone got some, you know, good practical applications and some takeaway points that they can implement for themselves moving forward.
Awesome. Good close. It was
Cool,
a pleasure,
man.
Doc.
Good close. All
Yeah.
right. Nice to talk to you guys.